Welcome to Philosophy 15. I'm Scott Aiken.
And I'm Robert Talese.
We're two philosophy professors talking about the philosophical things that are on our minds, 15 minutes at a time, unscripted. We're the authors of Pragmatism, Pluralism, and the Nature of Philosophy. And second edition, Why We Argue and How We Should, now in second edition from Routledge. Today, we're going to talk about an issue from ancient philosophy that's in some ways been a kind of regular touchstone for political philosophical discussions. Socrates' what looks like a sort of a pretty arch anti-democratic streak in Socrates. We see him in Plato's Republic coming out as a pretty staunch anti-democrat. And but we think that there are some complications to that thesis, and we've recently published a short essay at Three Quarks Daily, which will be linked down below, that you can follow up on that there. So, Rob, tell us about the puzzle of Socrates as an anti-democrat.
Well, so I think the first thing to note is that when we talk about Socrates, we're typically not talking about the historical character. Socrates, the man, the guy who walked around barefoot in Athens and was executed 399 BC by the Athenians for inventing new gods and corrupting the youth. We don't know much more about the historical Socrates than what I just laid out. When we're talking about Socrates, we're particularly talking about the character that is depicted in Plato's dialogues, the sort of leading character of the dialogues, or at least many of them, most of them. That Socrates' connection to the historical Socrates is unclear. The fictional character looks like he's based on Socrates, but clearly Plato is not simply reporting with his character the statements and doings of the historical Socrates, except maybe something in the Apology looks like we have reason to think that it comes close to what the historical Socrates actually said in his own defense at his trial. But anyhow, so first thing then is when we're talking about with Socrates an anti-democrat, we're really asking about the Socrates as he appears in Plato's dialogues. Now, the standard line about Socrates is that he is, as you said, a staunch anti-democrat. And throughout the dialogues, at least many of them, you can see why he gets that interpretation. He's often found criticizing the many for their lack of wisdom.
Yeah, it's pretty clear in the Crito, where it says, I don't care about the opinions of the many, I only care about the opinions of the wise.
That's right.
Right. So,
and in other places, even in some non-political contexts, it looks like Socrates is very suspicious of popular opinion. And if you think that democracy is, at least at a first pass, the kind of city that installs political power equally among citizens despite their wisdom or lack thereof, then it looks like democracy is going to be a city that is ruled by popular opinion. So if you're suspicious of the value of popular opinion, then democracy looks like it's not going to be the kind of city for you. Now, however, you do get a sort of a pretty direct critique of democracy in is it 7 and 8 of the Republic?
It's 8, yeah, 8 and 9.
8 and 9, sorry. 8 and 9 of the Republic. And there, the critique is pretty formidable. It runs that democracies or democratic cities look the most beautiful because they value liberality and freedom, and so it is the kind of city in which each person gets to decide for himself how best to live, and so it is a multicolored, flashy kind of political arrangement, and it looks like it's, from the outside at least, it looks best because of its freedom, its lack of constraints. But then the argument runs, once you look at democracy from the inside, you see that the lack of constraints is really just a thin veneer for a certain kind of servitude or subordination. That is, in the absence of constraints of a particular kind, that is, constraints that are directed by or organized around wisdom, each person is left to his or her own devices about how he or she should live, and therefore each person winds up being enslaved by their passions or by their basest desires. And so democracies wind up being cities in which people who are ruled by their desires, the citizens who are ruled by their desires, get manipulated and ultimately dominated by sweet-talking sophists who themselves seek political power for the sake of their own gratification.
That's right.
And so democracy ultimately devolves in the Republic into a kind of tyranny, where the people are tyrannized internally by their own base desires, and they are tyrannized politically by rulers that they themselves install, who exploit political power for their own personal gain. And so the outcome is inevitably an unjust city. Now, it looks as if it's a straightforward, attack on democracy, and it would be natural to think that anybody who launches that kind of critique would be fairly opposed, or would be straightforwardly perhaps opposed to democracy. And note, a lot of much of what goes on in the history of democratic thought is a case in which pro-democracy thinkers are trying to accommodate what's undeniably correct in that critique.
That's right.
Ordinary citizens are not wise. They're not well informed. They're easily manipulated.
Right. So when Winston Churchill says the best case against democracy is 5 minutes with the average voter, he's saying the Platonic thing.
The Socratic thing.
Right, the Socratic thing. We'll say the Socratic thing. Yeah. Right, thank you. So he's saying that thing, but it looks like he's nevertheless not an anti-democrat. So it's that double-mindedness that we've got to come to terms with.
That's right.
Being a critic of democracy and identifying its weak points doesn't make you an anti-democrat.
That's right.
But the case for Socrates as an anti-democrat isn't that he just had critical things to say of democracy. It's that the ideal city that he constructs in the Republic, the Calliopolis, the beautiful city, is one that is very clearly non-democratic. It's one that would be averse to democratic norms, and so on. So it looks like there's a sort of a 1-2 punch, or a sort of two features of Socrates as an anti-democrat. He's got critical things to say of democracy in the dialogue, and particularly he sees it at the sort of the bottom end of a very slippery slope of political decline in the closing books of the Republic. And then the second part is his ideal city, the best city, the city where justice is going to be most completely instantiated. That city is a city that is one that is staunchly anti-democratic, looks at the sort of the norms of individualism as ones that that create disharmony, that create confusion, that make people not capable of actually even being who they really are. You're inclined to think that following your desires makes you who you are, but that's Plato's Socrates in the Republic thinks that is a significant confusion. Makes you something that's a kind of parody of the kinds of things that you really should be. And so as a consequence, we need to come to terms not just with Socrates' critical things about democracy, but the alternative that he constructs.
Right, so good. That's a good way to lay it out. So we've got the criticism of democracy. Right. One beginning bit of pushback is all the critical things that Socrates says about democracy are things that, in the tradition of democratic theory, people are trying
Hamilton
to accommodate.
Said it,
right.
Yeah.
So,
Madison said it.
Mill,
Mill,
Rousseau, right? These are, right, democracy has to be theorized from the perspective of the ineliminable lack of wisdom, imprudence, imperfect information of citizens, right? And a lot of the institutional mechanisms that we've now come to associate with modern democracy, separation of powers, bills of rights, really is about managing all of that in a way that still preserves the fundamental democratic ideal of self-government among equal citizens. Okay, so that's one beginning piece of pushback, that the attack on democracy directly that you get in those later books of the Republic look like they're the kinds of critical things that democratic theory concedes and then tries to mitigate in some way.
Yeah, that's right. Good. Yeah.
Now,
so what about the alternative?
The stuff about the beautiful city, the perfectly just city, is really interesting, right? So, it looks like, well, he's a critic of democracy, and he overtly, from book 2 on in the Republic, he's constructing what he calls a perfectly just city, and that city is an absolute monarchy, or some kind of absolute oligarchy, perhaps, right? Yeah. Or absolute or aristocracy.
Aristocracy.
Right, it's not oligarchy, right? So
the rule by the best.
That's right, good. So as I'm sure everybody watching knows, the positive proposal, as it's commonly understood to be in the Republic, is that philosophers have to rule as kings. And rule as kings here is meant absolutely, by which we mean that in the beautiful city that Socrates seems to be recommending, the ruler, or the small council of philosopher rulers, regulate everything. Your occupation, where you're going to live, what you can hold in your hand as property, who you marry, when and whether, and if you do, how many children you can have, who gets to do the parenting. So it's the beautiful city winds up being this highly regulated, planned city in accordance with the philosopher king's wisdom.
Right.
Now, one piece of pushback about that, Socrates is a critic of democracy, but all democratic theorists concede most of that. Socrates is a promoter of this absolute philosophical kingship. Maybe, maybe not. I mean,
there are interpretive questions about whether or not Socrates is really endorsing the Kalliopolis. So what sort of pushback do you see there?
So, one, on a lot of interpretations of the Republic, the beautiful city is intended to be some kind of joke, or irony, or satire. And certain versions of that kind of interpretation run that Socrates is always arguing, in a sense, ad hominem, not in the sense of the fallacy, of the ad hominem fallacy. Right, good. He's constantly arguing to his particular interlocutors. In the case of the Republic, his main interlocutors are 2 soldiers.
Yep.
And 2 soldiers who see themselves as especially good with respect to the soldierly virtues. Right. And so Socrates is giving to them a description of the kind of city that he suspects is going to tickle them. And then, here's what I think is the major piece of pushback, and then Socrates says, well, it's a perfectly just city, it's a perfect city, but look, it still unravels.
Right. And I think that the second part of this is that he doesn't just appeal to Glaucon and Adeimantus as soldiers, he appeals to them as the kind of, given the temperaments that they've got. So whenever he's initially constructing the city, this is before the Guardians or anything like that, he's got what Glaucon calls the city of pigs, where he's got, we can eat some barley and we'll have like a bonfire and sing songs and things like that. And Glaucon says, that sounds like a city of pigs. It sounds like a city with no nice things in it. And he says, well, we need nice desserts and dancing girls and perfumes and couches to
luxuries.
Yeah, luxuries, right. And it's only then that Socrates thinks that you need the guardians, that you need this standing army to be able to maintain the wealth that's required for that city. And so, and in fact, it's because of Glaucon's inclinations of desire that even the way that because the guardians can't be rewarded with money or with anything long-standing, what Glaucon thinks that the guardians should be rewarded with is the fact that they can kiss whoever they like whenever they're...
Right.
And so that's the thing that actually makes the city unstable from within, because what produces that instability? An educational system that's overrun by too many children. You can't properly sort the folks if there are too many of them. And so it looks like there's a case that the perfect city has got a problem and isn't so perfect. So that's our second piece of pushback on Socrates as an anti-democrat. In the next episode, we're going to be looking at a positive case for Socrates's, what we might call a modest endorsement of democracy.
Philosophy 15, folks. See you in the next episode.